Well, hi, everybody. We are so glad to be here today. I'm excited to host this Facebook Live with our guests. So, I am Anne from GodLife, and our guest today, we're back with physician Glenn Wood. And Glenn, would you mind briefly sharing some of your credentials again before we get started in today's conversation?
Sure. I've been a pediatric and adolescent doctor for more than 35 years. I also have a master's of public health and so have been following the COVID-19 very carefully. Also talking to fellow physicians who have been seeing COVID-19 patients to see what their experiences have been. Because I'm a pediatrician, we don't see the really sick patients, of course, that adult and especially physicians who take care of elderly patients tend to see. But so that's why I've talked to more of my adult colleagues.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you. I know we've done part one and we're here to do part two today. And if you're listening and you have questions, feel free to drop a comment or question down below. And we'd love to try to answer some live if we can. If not, we will definitely follow up and answer the best we can later. So to start off, Glenn, have you had any new changes in your life from a Christian standpoint since you last spoke with Michelle a couple weeks ago?
Mainly, we're just trying to be good neighbors and care for other people. We're still not going out a whole lot. We're fortunate in that we don't have to. I'm actually semi-retired, and so I'm not seeing patients now. But when we do go out, we wear masks. We try to stay away from people because, of course, we now know that at least a third of the people who have the disease don't have any symptoms. So you don't even know you're sick, but you can still share it with others. So trying to be good about that. Obviously, lots of fear going on, answering lots of medical questions, but sometimes also kind of just, the Christian questions about what we should be doing as a church during this pandemic, and complicated by also the all the demonstrations that have gone on as well.
Yeah. And like you said, we'd like to look today at just a few different topics. We'd like to look at the science medical side of the pandemic and everything that goes along with that, and then also the faith side and how can our followers, our community continue to take the next steps with their faith in mind, and even
Sure.
people that may be struggling or maybe not sure of their faith. So as far as the pandemic, since we've last spoken to you, have you noticed any positive developments that have come out of the pandemic?
Well, I'm in Texas like you are, so maybe I'll start with some of the negatives. As we've all been reading, there's been an increased number of people who are being positively diagnosed in a lot of states around the country. A lot of southern states, Texas is one, being a large state, is one of the leading examples of that. I guess the good news about that is probably most of the people have been primarily younger. And that makes sense. Younger people have to get out and work. They're more likely to be in positions where they're interacting with people. And they know, as we all do, that they're not in as great a risk as somebody who has some sort of chronic illness or who is much older. Now, they do need to keep in mind that that they also need to be aware of who they're around. So if they're around older parents or grandparents or those who have chronic lung or heart disease or diabetes or something like that, they need to, even though they are personally getting out, they probably need to stay away. But I would also highly recommend people try to stay that 6 feet distance, try to wear masks, try to wear them properly. But there has been some good developments, and that is that we have a lot more evidence that we do have some good treatment now. And so before, certainly the first several months, all we really had was supportive treatment, meaning that, you know, if you got really sick, you can go in the hospital, you can get oxygen. In really bad cases, you can be put on a respirator, you can get IV fluids and so on. That's what we in the healthcare community consider just supportive care. It's not really doing anything to directly affect the virus or improve your immune system or other things that are really making things a whole lot better. So I know now of at least 3 things that probably are working. Again, it's sort of preliminary. There's been some preliminary studies. We've talked about the antiviral. I think we mentioned that even last week. Remdesivir probably works, at least in sicker people, to reduce the death rate. We do have concerns that we might run out of it, but that's helpful. There's been a recent study that probably a lot of our listeners have heard about, which was that there is a steroid dexamethasone that can also help, and that's nice because that's very inexpensive, is available everywhere, so that's not going to be a problem. And then finally, there's more evidence that getting the serum or the antibodies from somebody who has already survived COVID-19 can actually help a current patient to do better. At this point, you know, there may be a limited amount that's available there, but of course, as more and more people get infected, then we have more of that available. So all of that is good news. So even though our numbers are going up, the number of people who are really, really sick and being hospitalized or dying seems to be going down in the United States. Now, I know we have people across the world where that may not be true, and each situation is going to vary a lot depending on their healthcare system, depending on how crowded the country is, how easy it is to get to healthcare, and so on.
Great. And briefly, you touched on this a little, but we've heard that a vaccine can be developed quickly, and maybe some others disagree with that. Can you explain a little bit as to why that is?
Yeah, so we're kind of getting mixed messages on that, and that's kind of for good reason. Of course, we want to have the hope of that, but vaccines, the two most important things about vaccines is that they need to be effective and they need to be safe. So both of those take time to establish. So we already have, I think, well over 100 vaccines by, say, companies or universities that have researchers that we'll say are qualified to do this. And because we were able to identify the genetic code of the virus and the proteins on the surface, we could come up with forms of vaccines very quickly. So that's not the problem. The problem is establishing how effective these are and then being pretty confident that they're not going to have side effects. We've definitely had times where immune problems have come up with vaccines that where a vaccine has had to be removed from the market. There was another children's vaccine that was for a certain type of diarrhea that had to be removed because of causing problems with the intestines getting stuck inside itself. And so we could come up with a great vaccine, but then how long do we test it? Some vaccines in the past have been tested for as long as 20 years before they've been released. So it's kind of that cost benefit. If we release it too soon, maybe we save lives, but if it has some side effects, and maybe we cause problems. Choosing the right vaccine, and also think about where that vaccine is manufactured. I mean, in the United States, we have about 340 million people across the world, 7 billion. That's a lot of vaccines. Some of these vaccines may also have to be given 2 or 3 times to be effective. So there's a lot of questions that have to be answered. And of course, as we see the number of people dying, and we see countries like Brazil or other less developed countries having more problems with this, then there's that desperation that we want to come up with a vaccine, but we just want to come up with the right vaccine. So I think it's going to be clearly in 2021 when we'll have a vaccine, perhaps a year or later from now, where it would actually be released and be able to be manufactured for large numbers of people. So it's complicated, in other words.
It's complicated. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for the insight. That is helpful. So some of our audience members, like us, do attend church, and we've seen that some of the churches have been reopening, of course, with restrictions, following the guidelines, and some maybe haven't followed suit yet. So what are your thoughts on this? What do you think is the right approach here?
Well, it's difficult. This is not unfortunately, the virus is the horse out of the barn. It's out. We can't put it back. And so we're going to be dealing with this at a greater or lesser degree, basically from now on, just as when AIDS, HIV was released, that was out of the horse out of the barn, and so we had to deal with that and come up with treatments of that and other diseases, toxic shock, Legionnaire's disease, that are new diseases just in the last few decades. So we're going to have to deal with it, and to a certain degree, we're going to have to get back to a normal life. And the question that each person, I think, needs to ask themselves is, how much are they or their families at risk for this? So this may not be a really great time for people to go back to church who are elderly or who are young but have elderly people that they live with or say have to take care of, because even though it may not bother them very much, it very likely could harm the elderly parent or grandparent. The size of the church matters, how much space there can be. So our church is fairly large, and we're still not open at this point, but there have been some small, like group Bible studies or other groups that have met and just tried to be careful, and if it was crowded, to wear masks. So everybody ultimately is going to have to make those decisions about church and about going out into the community that goes beyond the requirements of getting food or having to go to the doctor or something like that.
Sure. And to switch gears a little bit, I know one of the questions that maybe people are wondering um, is, does God reveal things to us through scientific discovery? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, sure. I was a Christian when I went to medical school, and I would say that what I've discovered about the human body and its enormous ability to fight all sorts of diseases, from infections like we're dealing with COVID-19 to cancers and so on, it's very amazing, and it shows that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So all truth is God's truth. We talk about special revelation, which is the Word of God in the New and Old Testament. but there's also the general revelation that is revealed to us with science, with computer technology, with psychology, with all sorts of other things. So I think we can celebrate with excitement as long as those things are not misused. Unfortunately, all good things are also misused at times, and we can all think of ways that science can do that, or anything else. That can be with sexuality, with knowing how to interact with people and taking advantage of them. So I'm excited about the things that we learn in science as long as it's used to in a positive way for other people.
And along with that, so when we look at all the positive things that do come from science and some of the facts, how should Christians and some of our audience members who maybe aren't sure, where they're placing their faith right now, and maybe we can address it to two different people, but should they turn to God or science first? And how do you go about navigating that process?
Well, I think, we don't really have to make a separation because science, all good things come from God, and healthcare, to the degree that it's been helpful, particularly in the last century, is a blessing from God. On the other hand, God's not a God of fear. And so I think that to the degree that we're being reasonable about what we do, I think it may be testing God if we go and get in the middle of a very, very crowded place that has, thousands of people right next to each other. But to the degree that we have to go out, then we need to pray. We need to pray for our family members. We need to pray. Science doesn't do a whole lot about fear, whereas people are still fearful even when science is out there. So a lot of things science doesn't really cover. It doesn't cover spiritual matters. It doesn't really cover love and excuse me, morality and things like that. So I'm always, and have been throughout this, praying from the beginning for my family and also our country and across the world, that despite this terrible thing, that people can realize that they can't depend on science alone. They can't depend on their money or their government to take care of them, that they really need to look to God also.
Yeah, that's great. And because what happens when science and God's word disagree? Um, then how do we navigate
Well, yeah, I don't think that happens very often. And obviously, we're not here to talk apologetics, but I think the vast majority of times that the Bible is entirely has been a revelation even before the science was discovered about how the world works, and certainly how people work and how we should interact and love other people, and that's the most beneficial way to for the world to behave, although we don't always do that. So anytime I think that there might be a difference, I try to figure out how this has been misunderstood by scientists, and how the biblical approach is actually the right approach. But again, I would also say, the Bible doesn't talk about subatomic particles because it's a it's a book primarily on living and spirituality, not on particle physics, although it has cosmology and a lot of other things in it that do intersect with science as well.
And that's a good takeaway. Like you said, God, calls us, instructs us to love other people. And so when we are unclear during this time, uncertain about things, that's something we can go back to God's word. And we know that we can always serve out of love. We can love others, be kind, especially during this time when people are dealing with a lot of different things. So
Yes.
Well, we appreciate having you again today and just answering more questions. So I know that we'll have some comments and questions trickle in even after today, and so we'll be able to jump on that and answer. Um, let's see, we do have a couple comments, but I think we can answer most of them later. We had Zadok asked, how can a church in another continent be connected to yours? What we can do, Zadok, I'll share a link below with some more information, but we have a ton of resources for new believers where we would love to help provide that discipleship in your faith. And so we have lots of studies and content we can help guide you through. And you can visit our website, GodLife.com, for a lot of those. But we'll reply to these comments as well. So that looks like it for today, but thank you again, Glenn, and we'll see based on the comments if we need to come back again. And
sure.
we don't know how long this pandemic will continue. So in the meantime, everyone can remember just to be kind and love each other today like God instructs us. And again, check out GodLife.com for some of our great tools and resources to grow in your Christian faith. Well, thank you. We'll talk to you later.